Now, in case you missed it, about a month ago, the world was supposed to end. It was on April 23rd, which is, I think, a month ago Wednesday. This hypothetical rogue planet known as Planet X or Planet Nibiru or something like that. I don't know much about hypothetical rogue planets. I gotta just admit. I didn't even know they hypothetically existed. They don't. But it was supposed to crash into Earth on April 23rd, ending life as we know it. And unless I missed it, I don't think it happened. Right? I was napping, I think, so I might have missed it. But I always enjoy these doomsday predictions. They're usually accompanied with, all sorts of various commotion. But it includes these discussions about what would you do with the last 24 hours of your life if you knew, right, the world is going to be struck by an imaginary rogue planet tomorrow. And so I just did a little looking around, and I found some of the top items on people's end of the world as we know it bucket list. And so the first thing was quit my job. So how many of you, Derek, put your hand down. All right. Max out my credit cards on a shopping spree. Eat a really, really nice meal at an expensive restaurant. I like this. Tell your crush you like him or her. All right? On the flip side, tell people what I really thought of them. All right? And then party like there's no tomorrow, of course. And lastly, what may or may not surprise you is near the top of every list for what is like one of the most important things you need to do if you've only got, minutes to live is, anyone want to guess? Have sex, of course. That's, no. I have so many things that I wanted to say in response to that and so few things that I could say that we're just going to move on. But this is my favorite comment. This next bucket list item, it's reported that Mark Twain commented or said this desire for his last day on earth. He said, when the end of the world comes, I want to be in Cincinnati because it's always 20 years behind the times. So he figures he's got 20 years and 24 hours. If he's in Cincinnati. Well, today as we continue in our 1 Peter message series, which is entitled, When the Going Gets Tough, we're going to look at what the Bible has to say about the bucket list priorities of the followers of Christ. So it's talking to us here. The bucket list priorities of the followers of Christ. As the curtain slowly closes on the final scenes of world history, the Bible tells us these are things that you need to check off the list. And this idea of this being a bucket list here in our passage in 1 Peter 4 comes from verse 7, which says this, the end of the world is coming soon, therefore, ... There's a list of things that we're supposed to do in light of the closing curtain of world history. Now, it's important to know that the Apostle Peter, who penned these words, he wasn't like this doomsdayer who was, thinking that, we need to kick into some sort of desperation, final countdown moments, right? He wasn't thinking this is tomorrow or next week when he wrote this. What he was instead doing is he's calling the followers of Christ to live their lives in light of the end game. How are we to live our lives in the light of the end game? And in light of that, living our everyday lives, not like in a 24-hour desperation, suck it up and really give it a hard effort, but in light of the overall end game. This is what our everyday lives need to look like as the followers of Christ. And so backing up then to chapter 4, verse 1, here's what we read. So then, since Christ suffered physical pain, you must arm yourselves with the same attitude he had and be ready to suffer too. And so this verse is telling us that we need to arm ourselves. It's literally to weaponize yourself is the language that's being used, that Christians are to weaponize themselves in light of the end game, in light of life growing more difficult and hostile even towards the Christian faith, that we need to weaponize ourselves. And what is it that we're to weaponize ourselves with, according to this verse? We're to weaponize ourselves with the readiness to suffer with the same attitude as Jesus. So let's read this bucket list item, number one. In light of the end game, number one, let's read this together. Number one, armed with the readiness to suffer like Jesus. Now, you see those words in there in the verse. So then, since Christ suffered physical pain, you must arm yourselves with the same attitude he had and be ready to suffer too. We're to weaponize ourselves in light of the end game, church, with the readiness not to just suffer, not the readiness to suffer, but the readiness to suffer like Jesus. Hey, what are you stockpiling? You know, you're building your bunker, Christian, for the end times. What are you stockpiling? Well, I'm stockpiling this huge arsenal of the readiness to suffer like Jesus. Do you hear that? That's a bucket list. That was Jesus' attitude. Well, what was Jesus' attitude? We saw this, and we're going to review a little bit back in the end of chapter 2. What was Jesus' attitude in suffering? 2:21 through 23. God called you, he's talking to us, for God called us to do good. So that's one way we're going to suffer, with the doing good, and even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you, he is your example, and you must follow in his steps. He never sinned, nor ever deceived anyone. The context of suffering, he didn't sin, he didn't deceive anyone, he didn't retaliate when he was insulted, he didn't threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. And so in light of the end game, that is what we need to be arming ourselves with, church. As the going gets tough, as the going gets more and more tough, we need to arm ourselves with the readiness to suffer with that same attitude, the readiness to suffer and to not use our suffering as an excuse to sin. Because we do that sometimes, don't we? Well, I'm in pain. I deserve a little indulgence in sin, right? Arm ourselves with the readiness to suffer and not use our suffering as an excuse to sin. Arm ourselves with the readiness to suffer and not use our suffering as an excuse to deceive, to lie. Arm ourselves with the readiness to suffer and to not retaliate when we suffer. Arm ourselves with the readiness to suffer and not threaten back, not attack back. The readiness to suffer and still leave our case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. The readiness to suffer and still cling on to the truth that God is fair. He's going to do what's right, to trust him, even when it's getting bad this way, to trust that it's still good this way. Understand that? Right? That's how Jesus armed himself, and that's how we need to arm ourselves with, and more as the going gets tough. And so the question is, are you armed? Are we armed? Are we ready for that? Should that come in our lifetimes? It's this much now. Maybe in our lifetimes we'll see more. Are we armed? Are we ready to suffer like Jesus? You know, there's a story written in the book, the Fox's Book of Martyrs, about a woman named Blandina. I think I've shared this story years ago. But in the 2nd century Roman Empire, Christians suffered. You know, they were looked down upon as, idiots in the Roman Empire. They were ridiculed. They were discriminated against. They were publicly attacked. They were And that sounds kind of familiar so far. Well, they were eventually imprisoned, they were brutally tortured, and they were sentenced to death, and often sentenced to death in the public arena, in the coliseums and amphitheaters and whatnot. So one of those Christians was this little old servant lady by the name of Blandina, and Blandina was very worried that if she did have to face suffering, she would not be able to suffer and not renounce her faith. And she was very worried about it. And so here's what an eyewitness account of the way Blandina weaponized herself, so to speak, says, quote, "All of us were in terror, yet Blandina was filled with such power that even those who were taking turns torturing her in every way from dawn to dusk were weary and exhausted." They wore themselves out torturing this poor lady. And they themselves admitted that they were beaten, that there was nothing further that they could do to her, and they were surprised that she was still breathing, for her entire body was broken and torn. Nevertheless, the account goes on to say that Blandina, broken and torn, was forced into the Roman amphitheater along with some of her companions, picking up in the narrative. So Blandina was hung on a post and exposed as bait for the wild animals that were let loose on her. And she seemed to hang there in the form of a cross, and by her fervent prayer, so she's praying through this, she aroused intense enthusiasm in those who were undergoing their ordeal. But none of the animals actually touched her. And so she was taken down from the post and brought back to the jail to be preserved for another ordeal. Tiny, weak, and insignificant as she was, she gave inspiration to her brothers. Finally, on the last day of the gladiatorial games, they brought back Blandina again, this time with a boy of 15 named Ponticus. And every day they had been brought in, meaning these children were brought in, these other Christians were brought in to watch the torture of the others, while attempts were made to force them to swear by pagan idols. And because they persevered, the crowd grew angry with them, so that they subjected them to every atrocity and led them through every torture in turn. So it's basically everything they had in their arsenal to throw at these Christians, they threw at them. And the account goes on to conclude that after Ponticus had been whipped, mauled by animals, and finally suspended over an open fire on an iron seat, Ponticus died. And then Blandina, who had survived these exact same tortures, was finally tied up in a net and placed in a ring with a bull that gored, stomped, and tossed her until she was dead. And she never renounced her faith. She had armed herself with the readiness to suffer and to suffer like Jesus. Well, I hope to God we never have to face this. But for some of us, that might be easier to face than the insults and the ridicule and the mocking we take today as Christians, right? And we're seeing that getting more and more. Are we armed? Are we weaponized? Are we ready to endure that like Jesus, with the same attitude as Christ? And so that's the first item on our bucket list. So says the Apostle Peter. So says 1 Peter, to arm ourselves with the readiness to have Jesus' attitude when the going gets tough. All right, here's the second item that needs to be on the end of our world as we know it bucket list as Christ followers. It's an ongoing, life-giving conversation with the Father. So let's say that together. Ongoing, life-giving conversation with the Father. We see this if we jump down to verse 7. I'm going to cover next week some of the material we're skipping right now. But in verse 7, we read what we read just a moment ago. So the end of the world is coming soon. In light of the end game, church, be earnest and disciplined in your prayers. And so this verse is simply telling us that as the curtain is slowly closing on world history, it is vitally important. And I use that word quite intentionally. It's vitally important for us to have an earnest and disciplined prayer life. All right, now, I suspect that for many of you, that sounds like a burden. It sounds overwhelming. Yes, maybe? Nobody wants to admit it. An earnest and disciplined prayer life. So I want to explain something that will hopefully, redeem this, remove this from being burdensome, and actually cause this to be a life-giving bucket list item for you. And so the word earnest here, be earnest and disciplined in your prayers, actually comes from the exact same word. So I'm talking about the original language of the New Testament. So I'm getting a little word nerd here. You guys know I'm a word nerd, right? All right. So the word earnest actually comes from the original Greek word from which we get our English word diaphragm. It's diaphragm. And the implication is that which safely sustains life. That which safely regulates life. And so the picture of breathing, the picture that we need to walk away with from verse 7 for our bucket list is not, you need to pray more. You need to spend more time in lifeless praying. Because that's what some of us hear, right? The emphasis is, have an ongoing relationship with the Father, have an ongoing conversation with the Father that is life-giving. Be earnest. Be diaphragmatic in your praying. We exhale, just like breathing. We exhale bad air, right? We get the junk out. All right, Father, I just need to unload some emotional CO2 that's poisoning my heart. I need to unload some toxic thoughts that are poisoning my thought life. I just need to exhale all that. And then we need to inhale. Father, I just need fresh air from your lungs. I need oxygen breathed into my thoughts, into my heart, into my spirit. Father, I just need to breathe your breath of life. I need to breathe the fullness of your Spirit. Right? You get the idea here? That which sustains life, a prayer life, a conversation with the Father that is life-giving. Bad stuff out. Good stuff in. It's right, breathing. I think most of us do it most of the time, don't we? Because it's sort of important. It's that which sustains life spiritually as well. Now, the funny thing is, I think that as Christians, we almost have this tendency to get this spiritual breathing completely backwards, right? We think we can't be honest with God. We can't honestly completely exhale all the bad stuff to him, right? It's like, I got to keep that hidden from him. If I tell him, he'll know. I don't know where that idea comes from. He's God. So it's like we can't feel like we can exhale the bad air, and we don't believe that the Father wants to breathe into us good air. Right? And so we got it completely backwards. We hold our breath spiritually, which is not good. I get this picture in my mind as I was thinking about this point. It's like breathing in exhaust fumes, bad air, and then going outside into the fresh air. We got it completely backwards. We breathe in the good air, and we exhale the bad air. That which sustains life. That's what our conversation with the Father is supposed to look like. And that kind of relationship, that prayerful, life-giving, life-sustaining relationship with the Father is more and more important as the curtain closes, right? As we arm ourselves with the readiness to suffer like Jesus, it's going to be all the more important for us to exhale bad air right? To exhale what's happening with our hearts when we choose to endure it patiently, right? There's going to be hurts in here that we need to, there's going to be trauma happening up here that we need to, Father. And then there's going to be just the fullness of the Spirit, the breath of the Father that we need to inhale as we continue to weaponize ourselves to suffer like Jesus, right? That's super duper important, and that's why it's on the bucket list right here in 1 Peter chapter 4. If we don't do that, we will suffocate. That's not good. So the second item on our bucket list, and the end of the world as we know it bucket list, is to have this ongoing, life-giving, diaphragmatic, that's a word I'm making up, I think, conversation with the Father. And then thirdly, the third item that needs to be on our end of the world as we know it bucket list is this: fault-overlooking love for the family. That's us, family. That's church family. Fault-overlooking love for the family. Let's say that together. Fault-overlooking love for the family. Most important of all. Say that. Most important of all. Continue to show deep love for each other, for love covers a multitude of sins. I love these words, most important at all. Most important of all. The most important, absolutely most important thing that we can do as Christ followers as the curtain closes, in light of the end game, the most important thing we can do is show a deep love for each other. The most important thing we can do is to show a deep love for one another, and especially a deep love for one another. See, the context is the context of people's what? Sin. The most important thing we can do is show a deep love for one another, especially when it comes to dealing with one another's sins, when dealing with one another's faults and failures. The most important thing we can do in light of the end game is to show a deep love for one another in light of each other's crap. Can I say that in church? A deep love for one another in light of each other's crap. This is not a faint-hearted love. This is not a faint-hearted love to which we've been called. It's not the kind of love that loves people that I really love and they love me, right? That's easy. Jesus said that's nothing. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, read it. Jesus said, loving people who love you, anybody can do that. Rank pagans do that. It's nothing. It's nothing to love the lovable who love you and you love them. It's nothing. Am I making that clear? Anybody can do that. But we're called to a deep love. The word deep here is actually, word nerd, it's where we get our English word extend. Extended love, an elastic love. A love that just keeps stretching, extending, stretching. It's carrying more and more crud. And it's stretching. It's flexible. It doesn't break. A flexible love for the family, for the house, that covers crap. The word cover here, word nerd, it's where we get our word kleptomaniac. I love that. It hides, it conceals. The implication is not actually of klepto is not to steal, it's to conceal, to hide, to cover up. All right. So pulling this all together, we're to have this flexible love. It just keeps extending. Flexible love that overlooks, it just overlooks a whole bunch, multitude, plethora. A flexible love that overlooks a plethora, a whole bunch of each other's crap. That's the Kent version, the Kent translation. That's how we're called to live our lives as Christ's followers in light of the end game. Just love that keeps stretching and overlooking one another's junk. Story is told actually of an elderly couple. They're celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and when they were asked, what's the secret to your long and happy and lasting marriage, the woman replied, well, this is what I did. When we got married, I decided that I would make a list of my husband's top 10 worst faults, and for the sake of the marriage, I decided I'm just going to overlook his top 10 worst faults. And so she was asked, well, what was on the list? And she said, well, to tell you the truth, I never got around to making the list, but every time he did something stupid that made me really mad, I decided to say, lucky for him, that was on the list. All right? That's how we're called to live our lives in the house. That's how we're called to live our lives in light of the end game, is just to operate in this inoffensible, flexible love that overlooks a whole bunch of each other's crap. Proverbs 19:11 says, it is our glory to overlook an offense. It's an honor. It's a privilege to overlook an offense. And so that's the third item that needs to be on our end of the world as we know it bucket list as Christ followers, is a fault overlooking love for the family. So actually, that's where I'm going to wrap up this morning. Wow, it's early. We're going to actually circle around to finish the rest of this passage in about a month. So about a month from now, we're going to get to the rest of this passage. That is, if the world doesn't end between now and the end of June. But actually, in all seriousness, is time going to run out on world history tomorrow? All right, is planet Nibiru going to crash into us? I don't know. Is it going to end next month? Is it going to end in our lifetime? I don't know that. But I do know this, that in one way or another, every single one of us is living on borrowed time, right? One way or another, we're all living on borrowed time. And so our Heavenly Father who loaned us the time we have, whatever amount of time that is, our Heavenly Father has put a couple items on our must-do end game, bucket list before we punch our time card. Right? He's expecting us to arm ourselves with the readiness to suffer like Jesus. Yeah, worship team, you can go ahead and come forward. To arm ourselves with the readiness to suffer with Jesus' attitude, to suffer like he did. 1 Peter 2:21-23. To arm ourselves with the borrowed time that we have, everyday lifestyle. This is not desperation mode for 24 hours. This is just the rest of the borrowed time we have to have this ongoing, life-giving conversation with the Father, breathing out, breathing in, out, in. And to maintain this fault-overlooking love for one another.